Hello, and welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folk tales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle, and I am reporting here from Pepper World headquarters, and I'm incredibly excited. Today, we are going to talk about Joan of Arc, my queen, my icon, non-binary influencer, feminist dream. And you weren't living right. If you weren't burned at the stake for being a witch in medieval Europe, you weren't living correctly. And spoiler alert, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake for witchcraft and other offenses, which thus proves that she was living correctly. We're going to get into all kinds of things. We're going to talk about the political landscape of medieval Europe. We're going to talk about the religious landscape of medieval Europe and talk about what it's like to be a woman on planet Earth, to be a human who does not conform with gender norms and the consequences, the interpretation of your actions, and really what it's like to be a spiritual person without a position of power, and truly the cult like aspects of human culture. You know what just occurred to me? Cult and culture must have the same root word, which means that I am going to have to look up the etymology. What is the etymology of cult? Etymology, ology of cult. If you don't know, you got to sound it out. Am I right? Am I right? Okay, the English word cult comes from the 17th century French culte. It's spelled the same with an E on the end. It derives from the Latin cultus, meaning care, cultivation, or worship. This Latin term itself comes from the colere, meaning till, to cultivate or to worship. The word shares its root with culture and cultivate, initially referring to a system of worship or religious devotion without any negative connotation. However, by the 19th century, the word cult began to acquire negative pejorative meanings, eventually referring to a group with excessive, often harmful devotion, or to a person or belief. Fascinating. Fascinating. Well, just another day in the life here on planet Earth. And I just want to remind everyone, I hope you're taking good care of yourself. So much misery lives in the world, so much violence, so much devastation. And I know that the best way that we can show up is to take good care of ourselves. And by taking care of ourselves, we are more likely to show up as the best versions of ourselves. And if we all showed up as the best versions of ourselves, we would be able to dismantle colonization, dismantle violence, and dismantle human exploitation. Wouldn't that be great? So, this is my invitation to you. Just a quick reminder that even though sometimes it feels like we're helpless and it feels like we can't do anything, by really focusing on taking care of yourself and focusing on finding ways that you can find peace, finding ways where you can find happiness and you can find joy is so revolutionary. Because on our worst days, we often do our worst. On our worst days, we're more likely to make decisions that hurt others. Now, if you're probably listening to this, you're probably not like in the military, or I mean, you're probably not like calling the shots and starting nuclear wars. But you know what? Maybe you are listening and you do have that kind of power and you are starting nuclear wars. Are you in a good mood on those days? No, you're stressed. You're angry. We need to all find ways to regulate our own nervous systems. We need to find ways to show up as the best versions of ourselves so that we can end human suffering and end unnecessary violence. There's my hot take. Speaking of which, I have a meditation that will be coming out soon on YouTube about regulating your nervous system. So go check it out. So let's get into it. Let's talk about our girl, our queen, our icon, Joan of Arc. This bitch did so much all before the age of 19. Imagine, okay, a teenage peasant girl from France walks into a medieval court of cynical nobles, all men. France is fractured, it's on the brink of collapse, and yet she points to a hidden man in the room, and she says to him, "You are the rightful king." Within months, the course of history changes within medieval Europe. This is the story of Joan of Arc, a visionary, a warrior, a martyr, a soothsayer, and of course, later, a saint. But to understand Joan of Arc, we first need to understand the chaotic world, the setting that which she was born into, and thus blossomed. This is the story of Joan of Arc. Boom, boom, boom. I need to get like more like intense music because I feel like this is so epic. This is an epic one. And you know what? I know that there is a film about Joan of Arc, which I actually haven't seen, but this is a film that I would love. I wish, yeah, I would love to direct a Joan of Arc film. Um I feel like her life is so underappreciated. I know that she kind of has become an icon in pop culture, but I think like to really imagine yourself as this woman, as this girl, she was barely a woman, and the things that she did in her life, and she was so driven by her own intuition and her own belief and her own connection with God. Like this woman's an icon. Okay, let's get into it. Let's get into all the details, babe. So, just for some context, okay? Joan of Arc was born right around the year 412. Her exact birthday is unknown. I would maybe guess that she's an Aries, but I'm biased. But sorry, did I say 412? I meant 1412. Strike that from the record and let the record show. She was born in 1412. Whoopsie daisies. So, this was a really intense time in medieval Europe and specifically in medieval France. So during this time, there was what was called the Hundred Years' War. Now, I'm shouting out to one of my high school professors, Dr. Lumsden. Love Dr. Lumsden. Dr. Lum Lum would always joke that historians lacked all creativity because the Hundred Years' War was for how long? You guessed it, 106 years, which doesn't really make sense. It's not really 100 years. It's the 106-year war. But alas, historians call this the Hundred Years' War. Essentially, to keep it simple, this war was started as a dynamic struggle between the um, kings of England and the kings of France. And essentially, there was an argument over land disputes and rightful rulership. So, unsurprisingly, the British felt like they were entitled to French land and therefore entitled to a large portion of the French throne. Of course, the French kings were pissed, and this started a 106-year war. So specifically, a man named Edward III, who is the grandson of Philip IV of France. Um, and Edward III was English. So he, like, if you bear with me, because his grandfather was French, right? He claimed that he deserved the French crown. And this was in the year 1337. Classic nepotism scandal, and thousands die. Like, pause. How many fucking times will these rich kids start drama where regular commoners, in their words, peasants, have to literally pay with their lives? Like, literally, get over yourselves. This is crazy. I feel like if you are a rich person and you have beef, like you need to throw hands. Like you need to handle this yourself one on one. I don't support violence, but if you need violence to fix this, like that's on you and your buddy over your own land dispute. Like this is like literally what all wars are about. These are about entitled people who feel entitled to land and feel entitled to ownership of things that they shouldn't own because you can't own land. That doesn't make any sense. We are literally like free roaming creatures. It's like a bumblebee deciding that it owns things. We don't own anything. This is the earth. Oh my God. Oh my God. I'm getting riled up right now. Okay, so classic. Edward III, he's British. He thinks he deserves France. Classic, right? And so, of course, there's a French resistance. A large portion of French nobles start rallying around what is known the Salic Law. And this bars succession through the female line. Okay, so, oh, and that's what it is. Okay, because Edward III, this British guy, his grandpa is his maternal grandpa. So he feels like he's entitled to the crown from his maternal line. And so now they're putting this law forward. Oh, you can't claim ownership through your mom's side. Classic, right? So this is just like riddled with sexism. This is riddled with entitlement. And this is riddled with the makings of thousands of regular people dying on behalf of entitled white men. Classic. Classic. Okay. Also, this is a really interesting time, not only politically, but also religiously. So, right, like right around the Hundred Years' War and during the Hundred Years' War, the French monarchy is starting to get weakened. Okay. And there's also a lot of territorial losses and demands from other European countries. Also, mind you, the bubonic plague devastated Europe and was having resurgences. Like sometimes it would lay dormant for hundreds of years, then there would be a resurgence. A fun episode you can listen to is about The Devils, which is a movie from the 70s based off of a real story where a convent of nuns in France claimed to be possessed by the devil and had sexual fantasies. It's wild. But you can learn a lot about the context of France at this time, where there was a lot of religious dogma, a lot of like political tension between the church and the government. And the plague. I mean, it's just like a wild time to be alive, and I can knowingly say I have no interest to live in medieval Europe at all. No, thank you. Okay, so there's a lot of like political overturning happening. There's what is called the resurgence, which happens in the 1370s, between the 1380s. A man known as Charles V or Charles the Wise regains ownership over large pieces of land in France, based because he has his own personal military. So there's a lot of like vigilante nobles who are just kind of like getting what they want because they happen to have their own armies. And between the 1390s and the 1410s, there is what is known as French disarray. King Charles the Sixth suffers from bouts of madness. So this leaves a vacuum of authority, right? There's a king, but he's insane. And so authority is just kind of like it's, what's what I'm looking for? It's a no man's land. It's kind of like a do what you will. So a lot of noblemen are really like seizing the moment. This is like creating chaos in France in general. Obviously and unsurprisingly, there are families in France that are like head to head opposing each other. One of the most famous rivalries is between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, the people of Burgundy and the people of Armagnac, which I've never heard. Let's see if I can say this in a French accent. A ver. Armagnac, Burgundian. I just had to do it. I'm sorry. Okay. So now France, because of these two families that are head to head, because they both want to be the highest ranking noble and then eventually king, this starts a French civil war. Great. So France is like going full chaos mode. Arguably chaotic evil. That's, you know, and By the time 1415, there's a huge slaughtering of French nobility. French loses an entire generation of knights um, because of the English um, occupation of France. They are gunning for the crown, and the king is mad. It is kind of giving Game of Thrones. It's the same vibe. Okay, so now in 1420, so at this point, 1420, Joan of Arc is like 8 years old. In the year 1420, Henry V of France is recognized as the heir of the French throne, disinheriting Dauphin Charles. Dauphin is kind of like the French equivalent of a duke, give or take. So right now in France, we have a British king who's claiming the throne. And this creates an alliance between the English and the Burgundy family. And this is the setting that Joan of Arc is born into. She is born into an occupied France, occupied by the British. There was just 100 Years' War. There was just a civil war, and technically the 100 Years' War doesn't even end until 1453. So she's born almost in the middle of the 100 Years' War, and she is born right after the siege of the French throne. And now let's get into our girl, our sweet angel baby, Joan of Arc. I am honestly like really obsessed with her. I just think that she's amazing. So, Joan of Arc was born right around the year 1412. She was born to a very modest family. They were peasant farmers living in the north of France. And the region was known as Domremy. Domremy. We did our best. And this was a small village located in the area of Lorraine. Her father was named Jacques of Arc, and her mother was Isabelle Romain. Isabel Romy. There's an English translation. Though they were peasants, they were very well off. Her dad had a side gig where he worked for a local noble family, and once a month he would collect taxes in the area. So for peasants, they were very well off. Growing up, Joan was known as pious. She often went to church to do her confession, and she absolutely adored church. She was obsessed with church. During her childhood, she was known to be deep in thought and would talk regularly about seeing visions. Mostly her life was very simple. She did a lot of household chores. She was known to spin wool, and she would help her father in the fields looking after the plants and the animals. Oh my God, she's my kind of girl. Her mother provided Joan's religious education, and during Joan's youth, there was a prophecy that circulated the French countryside based on the visions of a woman named Marie Robin of Avignon. This woman claimed that she was having visions of an armed virgin who would come forth to save France. Get out of here. And so, as Joan grew older, she herself had more visions. She would have visions of Saint Michael, who was the patron saint of her area. And he was also seen as the defender of France. She stated that she had these visions frequently throughout her life and that she often had them when she would hear the church bells ring. Like, what? I am kind of obsessed with her. Let's take a quick break. Esoterica and Nonsense wants to hear from you. We have listener episodes coming, and I want to tell your story. Maybe you've had a really freaky dream. Maybe you had some crazy religious experience. Maybe you grew up in a cult. Maybe you actually just have some random stories that your grandma used to tell you growing up. Maybe you just want to share something random with me. The floodgates are open. Please email in your story at esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com. Any story that comes to your mind, I want to hear it, even if you just want to say hi. We love that. We are all for it. And get ready for some listener episodes coming soon. Okay, so our girl is a sweet country girl and she is a full-on believer. She's having visions. She is a little magical baby. So, as Joan of Arc grows older, she starts realizing through her visions that she herself is the prophecy. She herself is the virgin who will defend France. And so she decides to seek an audience with the Dauphin, the Duke of France, who one day will become king. Spoiler. So she journeys to an area of France known as Vaucouleurs, and she asks to be escorted by a commander known as Robert Baudricourt. I just find French names so entertaining. So she goes and requests an audience with the Dauphin, and she is mocked. They literally openly make fun of her. Um, and so she decides to go back. She meets with him another time, and this time in Chignon. And she dresses as a man. She cuts her hair and she wears men's clothes. And through local support and persistence, she convinces the Dauphin that she herself is being called upon by God to join the French military and deliver them from occupation. And so eventually, they give her permission. And actually, sorry, I messed up. At this point, she's talking to Charles the Seventh. And so she joins the military, and they fully think that she's a man. She has cut her hair like this is Mulan, baby. So, because she claims that she has all these visions, they were like, we need to make sure you're not a nut job, of course. Um, so in 1429, they get a bunch of clergy members and priests. They show up, theologians, and they examine her. They ask her questions and they discuss her condition and her visions. And they decide that there is no heresy in anything she says, and everything she says sounds like it's above board, and that God, in fact, told her to do it. And so they declare that she is a good Christian. She's given the green light and she's allowed to accompany the army. She's given armor, a horse, and a banner. Interestingly, like part of her legend is that she was not given a sword. And I think this is very symbolic because they see her as like a warrior of God and not of violence. However, most likely they gave her a fucking sword. Like this feels more like the legend sees her as this warrior of God. But there's just no way that she would be joining the army without a sword. Like maybe they gave her a mace. I don't fucking know. But like they gave her a weapon. Come on. Let's not be ludicrous here. This is crazy. So literally Joan at this point, it's 1429. Our girl was born in 1412. She's 17 years old. She is a 17-year-old girl who grew up on a farm praying and taking care of animals. Like she's literally an angel. She's had no formal training in fighting or anything to do with being a knight, but she was very skilled at riding a horse. And so on the campaign trail, she learned how to fight. This is, I mean, like, honestly, how hot is this? This is so hot. I love her. I literally love her. It is said that she was given custom made white armor. And in some stories, she was awarded a sword from the shrine of Saint Catherine, which also doesn't really make sense. Like at this point, they don't see her. They do believe that she's had visions, but they just see her as some guy. So like it is important to remember that this at this point has become a tall tale. And we're going to get to it in a second. But like, as I mentioned earlier, they kill the fuck out of her when they find out she's a woman. They are not down with the fact that she's a woman. And they just decide that she's a fucking evil bitch with like who practices witchcraft and deception and like, it's like a trial of hating all things not gender conforming, essentially. So I do think it's interesting. Like, obviously, now she's considered a saint in the French Catholic tradition. And so, like, I do think, yeah, it's important to remember that there's aspects of these stories where they kind of add in like flourish and filigree, and they've probably erased a lot of actual details from her life. I would bet money that when they thought she was a man, and she was a part of these winning armies, that they may have had more lore about her that was like more detailed and perhaps like celebrating her. And then after they killed her, I would bet money on it that they burned a lot of her records, and we have lost a lot of the true nuance of her life. And now a lot of these are basically tall tales. She did exist, but like there's an aspect of like Paul Bunyan, whatever. That's like the first example that came to mind. But you get where I'm coming from, right? We can't like trust all of these details. Most likely, some people say she doesn't have a sword, and now some people are saying she has a sword from the shrine of Saint Catherine. Like, get real. Okay. So, according to the legends, she is known to, quote, prefer the banner over the sword. She prefers the cause over violence. Obviously, this is symbolic, this is inspiring, it's visible in battle. She is become a symbol for like belief in victory and less about nameless violence. Again, this is alleged. Like, we have no idea how she was fighting. Like, for all we know, she could have been impaling people and decapitating them and having the time of her life. I mean, however, on the other hand, she could have been in full Buddha mode and like on the battlefield being like, let's talk about it, and like converting people to Christianity. We don't really know exactly how she was fighting on the battlefield, but all we know is that everyone believed that she was a boy. So I have reason to believe that she was fitting in. She was probably murdering people and, really butching it up. Again, I want to see this movie. I just love her. She she allegedly was known for having a huge moral force, and her morality shone brighter than her tactics of violence, allegedly. She was against looting, she was against swearing, get out of here, and she was against visiting sex workers, which checks out. She was a woman and she was probably disgusted by the behavior of men. And allegedly, she also raised the army's discipline and morale. Because this is a woman who very much believed in God and very much believed that she was the prophecy to free France. And so she's not there for fun, and she's not there by obligation of the state. She's there by obligation of herself and her own agreement with God. Iconic. So she believed that for them to win, they had to execute bold and aggressive attacks instead of slow sieges. She really thought that they really need to go head first and make really, really strong, bold attacks, which, I mean, it's war. So come on, a little bit of a no-brainer there. And non-surprisingly, these tactics often prove effective, and this would shock the cautious generals. I mean, this is not rocket science. I also just want to bring up here, um, like there are so many women in history that have been erased through misogyny, like queens, queens of Egypt, queens of Europe, who have literally been erased through time. And they are often much more successful in war than men, um, for a multitude of reasons. Um, And I just think it's really interesting that not only have women been erased from history, but this idea that women are like ill-equipped at war. And in my opinion, I think that perhaps why women often excel in positions of war is because war is the last resort. And I don't think women are like romanticizing war. And so I think their thinking is all about making the quickest decisions possible to end the war. I mean, it's not rocket science, babe. And perhaps, and again, this is just my personal theory, but I have noticed that in some parts of machismo culture, men grow up romanticizing war. They grow up fetishizing war. And so I do think that some of the men who rise ranks are not necessarily thinking about the quickest exit. Their career is war. And so I think they're thinking more about their personal interests as a career man and how the war or possible future wars relate to their career. Um, which is dark because in a sense they actually may prefer time of war. That's like their sport, that's their career. And so that's like a completely different point of view, right? Again, these are my own personal pontifications. Tell me what you think. Okay, and so another aspect of Joan of Arc was her charisma. It is written in multiple accounts how charismatic this woman was. Many soldiers believed that she really was divinely guided, and her presence raised morale dramatically. She was a true believer in God, and she had her own relationship with God. She had visions. Like this girl's magical. And again, like she was raised at a time where Christianity just was what was available, but like I really I really do believe this woman was having visions, and perhaps some of them were influenced by her own psyche, and that her own psyche was projecting these visions, but like she was inspiring men. She was a 17-year-old girl dressed as a boy, and grown men were like inspired by her and listening to her. Like this woman's a fucking icon. Okay, so now here we are. It's the spring of 1429, between April and May, and this is what we call the campaign of, in English we would say Orleans, like New Orleans, Orleans. I believe in French it's Orléans, but again, we're just gonna say Orleans because we're Americans, and I'm an American and I'm doing my best. So, in October of 1428. The city of Orleans was besieged. And so, leading up to the spring, Joan enters the city with supplies, and people cheer. They cheer to her as their savior. They take the city back, and she urges aggressive assaults on the English forts around the city of Orleans. And after many fights, she is wounded by an arrow in her shoulder, but she still returns to the battlefield. And finally, on May 8th, the siege is lifted. And this is a huge turning point of the Hundred Years' War. The French have officially reclaimed a city that had been sieged. And so now morale, not just in the military, but all around France, is being raised. And then into June and July of 1429, um, the military captures 3 more cities. And now the French are literally reclaiming territory that has been stolen from them by the English. And they are able to defeat an English military that has a lot of bowmen, a lot of archers. And obviously, at this time, archers were a state of the art perk of having a military. You could kill people from afar. And if they were skilled, it would be much easier to defeat an army than hand-to-hand combat. And even though they had so many archers, the French military still prevailed. And Joan insists that Charles himself go to the city of Reims for the coronation, a sacred act that confirms his divine kingship. So Joan is insistent, like, we need to reappoint our French king. They have stolen the crown. Now that we've taken back all of these cities, we need to reappoint a French man as the king. And this is like the pivoting point that we need for French belief in the French Republic. And so on July 17th, Charles VII is crowned. And Joan stands beside him, holding her banner. She's like literally still 17 years old, and now she's standing next to the King of France. Like she has worked her way up the ranks through her piety and through her belief in God. Like this woman is an icon. So finally, between 1429 and 1430, this is like right at the end of 1429 in September, The French military tries to reclaim Paris, and in the process, Joan is wounded. And so, because she was deemed unfit to fight, they put her on the sidelines. And Joan, even though she wasn't fighting, she was championing this idea that they needed to continue an aggressive offense. They needed to keep continuing aggressive attacks. However, Charles VII, who is now king, preferred to negotiate with the family of Burgundy. And so, sadly, he was incorrect. Again, he should have been listening to our girl. Our girl was divinely guided. And in the area of Compiègne, which does sound like companion, which does sound, reminds me of the word company, which means to share bread with. Shout out to the Gods of Grain episode. Check that out. So in May 1430, the French military is ambushed outside of Paris by the Burgundians. And specifically, Joan of Arc is sold to the English for 10,000 livres, the currency at the time. And Joan of Arc is taken to an area known as Rouen for trial. So she is now behind enemy lines. She is sold as a prisoner of war because she is so well known. She is literally like the figurehead of the French military, and she is sold for 10,000 smackaroonies to the British, and now she's on trial. Like, oh my God. And she's 17. Like, I'm sorry, your fave could never. Your fave could never. So her trial takes place between January and May of 1431, and her trial was led by a bishop known as Pierre Cauchon, and he was a pro-English Burgundian. So this man is French, but he is siding with the British. We hate him. He sucks. So he decides that Joan of Arc is a heretic. She practices witchcraft. She's practicing cross-dressing because obviously they discover that she's a woman, and that she has been disobedient to the church. Classic, classic. And Joan, one of her most famous responses to this charges, she says, "If I am not in God's grace, may God put me there. If I am in God's grace, may God keep me there." She's saying, like, only God can judge me, bitch. That's what she's saying. And then we cue fucking only God can judge me. Like, are you kidding me? Oh my God. Like, this woman is 17 talking to grown men who want to murder her. And she was like, only God can judge me. Bitch. Ugh. However, she eventually is pressured and pressured into dressing like a woman. They put her in her cell and they dress her like a woman. They're like, you cannot cross dress. You're a witch. You're the worst. And allegedly in her cell, some of the guards like really loved her. And also apparently many people tried to rape her. So some of the guards brought her male clothes so that she could feel safe. And then of course, by wearing men's clothes, they decided that she, quote, relapsed as a heretic. And so she was sentenced to death. Are you a fan of the podcast and want everyone to know? Well, guess what? We have merch live. There are sweatshirts, t-shirts, tank tops, water bottles, stickers, all kinds of things. There's also some other like random fun things of my personal art. But why not get a tote bag, a tumbler, and a hoodie to tell the world that you listen to the pod? Check it out. There's a link in the description of this video and a link in the description of my podcast and channel. Check me out, babe. So naturally for her execution, because she was convicted of witchcraft, a regular beheading would not do, and they decided to burn her at the stake. And they burned her in the marketplace, like, which is ugh, gross, in the marketplace of this area known as Rouen. And right before that she was burned alive, she requested a cross. And so a British soldier assembled her a Christian cross using two sticks. And it is said that she held it to her heart as they burned her alive. And her last words were allegedly, Jesus. I imagine it was like, Jesus Christ. And so after she was burned alive, they scattered her ashes in the Seine River to prevent a relic cult. Ugh. And this was all by the time she was 19 years old. What a life. What a woman. What a literally a girl. So, of course, after she died, this really rocked French morale. The French were doing so well. They were really gaining a lot of confidence, and they made some missteps. Now the British have power. Their girl, Joan of Arc, has been killed. And then also she was a woman. So I think this really threw people off. Classic misogynist men who completely believed in her while she was presenting as a man. Now that they find out she's a woman, are like, oh, she was a liar. However, there was all of this resistance in motion, a revolution in motion. And so the French continued and they prevailed. In the year 1455, there was what was known as the rehabilitation trial. And this declared her trial as unjust and it cleared Joan's name. Interestingly, even though they cleared her name, she was not considered a model for other women. Even though she was considered exceptional, because she was a woman, there was an odd perception of her. And in a weird way, because she broke out of her gender norms, it was not really fully celebrated as if she had been a man with the same visions and the same call to save and protect France, right? However, as time went on, she really did become a symbol of female courage, of of divine mission, and of French resistance. And finally, in the year 1920, she became the patron saint of France. She was claimed by monarchists, Republicans, feminists, and resistance fighters alike. Also, another thing to think about too is during some of the Catholic reformations through France, such as some of the Protestants and the Jansenists. There is a great episode I have about Jansenism, and you should check it out. There was a lot of religious reformation happening through France leading up to the French Revolution. And big parts of those French Catholic Protestant Reformation movements were that people started to feel that their connection with God was about their personal connection with God and had less to do with going to church and had less to do with needing guidance from a priest. It was about cutting out the middleman and having a personal relationship and experience with God. And so another big aspect of her fame and as a figurehead as time went on was about the appreciation people had for her own conviction religiously. She had her beliefs and had her visions, and no one could really claim they were wrong because she was successful in battle and her strategies were effective. And regardless of the time period, regardless of being a woman, she still chose to fight. Regardless of everyone thinking her ideas were crazy, she stood by them and she stood by her own beliefs. And I think this was one of the biggest reasons why she ended up becoming a saint. But I think even bigger than that is the fact that she's a woman. Ooh, I have this little itch on my shoulder. To be a woman at a time where you honestly don't really have a lot of rights. And I think it would have been so easy for her to just say, oh, well, I'll never be able to be in the military because I'm a woman. But she fucking did it. And so as time went on, especially into the 20th century, women started seeing her as an icon. Women started seeing her as a role model, as a person who defied all social expectations and social norms and did whatever the fuck she thought was right, which is iconic. So interestingly, like leading up to her canonization. So again, she wasn't considered a saint until 1920, which is fairly recent. So in the 1780s, her legacy was very contested. Revolutionaries saw her as a nationalist figure. They saw her as the daughter of the people, the daughter of France. And of course, the monarchs and the Catholics saw her more as a religious figure. So they see her as someone who beyond all contest, she is connected with God. And like, okay, this is like another really interesting element too, because ultimately I am obsessed with her, but I also am very anti-war. I mean, there's just nothing you can say that makes me pro-war. I just think war shouldn't it shouldn't be happening with grown adults. Like, anyway. So it's interesting that the the church the church is choosing to see her as a saintly figure because she has a connection with God, but ultimately she's using her connection with God to justify murder. Right, like, which is like an interesting element, but I think ultimately that is a big aspect of a lot of major religion, is that a lot of major religions turn into vehicles to justifying violence, due to whatever reason that they have. And so anyway, I do find that to be a fascinating angle. So in the year 1905, the government of France passed a law known as the Law of Separation of Church and State. And this, um, we kind of all are familiar with this concept. But at this time in 1905, tensions were running high because there had not been a separation of church and state. And her perception as a person was very interesting. She was seen as a freedom fighter, but also as a woman of God. And often the revolutionaries and the church were at odds because a lot of the revolutionaries wanted a separation from the church. And interestingly, after World War I, and again, this is in the 1920s, so France had survived the trauma of the First World War, but France was devastated politically and socially. And so at this point, after World War I, Joan was appreciated even more because she was seen as a martyr. She became this perfect unifying symbol of courage, of patriotism, and of sacrifice because, of course, she did die. And so people saw her. I think it became easier for them to palate that perhaps their father or their friend died in war. And so to think of them as a saint, to think of them as someone who fought for France and sacrificed their life for France, and to see them in a similar light as Joan of Arc, I think gave people a lot of hope and made them feel like their loved ones had not died in vain. And even though there was some tensions in her perception, ultimately after World War I, it unified France. It unified the religious people with the revolutionaries because they all saw her as the daughter of France, like their goddess of war. And so Joan became the patron saint of soldiers of France. She was canonized as a gesture of reconciliation between the church and the French Republic. And during her coronation, if you will, as a saint, thousands of people attended. Both politicians and clergy stood side by side. And mind you, this is almost 500 years after she was killed. And I do want to bring this up because obviously her story and life is much different to the story of Jesus, for sure. But I do think there's some interesting parallels that I want to speak on, which is this idea of condemning someone and sentencing them to death. And then years later, turning them into a saint or a prophet. And I think that this is a really interesting tendency that humans have. And this is like what I was talking about earlier, a cult-like quality of human culture. Humans are riddled with fear. And of course, Joan was captured by the enemy and was ultimately sentenced to death by them. But instead of just seeing her as a prisoner of war and just seeing her as a warrior or a soldier, they saw her as a witch. They saw her as a cross dresser. They saw her as ultimately a symbol of so much more than war. She was a symbol of connection with spirituality. She was a symbol of breaking gender norms, and she was a symbol of freedom. And ultimately, this they couldn't have. They could not have it. And the reason why I'm bringing up Jesus specifically is that, interestingly, of course, Jesus was killed by the Romans. And about 450 years later, Rome made Christianity its official religion and appointed a pope who would then be the head of the Christian religion. And I find it fascinating. I find it fascinating that the same people who would kill her are now the people who revere and celebrate her. And in a sense, it's safer once they're long dead, it's safer to revere them because the government or, whoever can control the narrative of what they're supposed to symbolize. And yet she was killed for being a radical. She was killed for being too radical and is now being celebrated as a fighter for France and as a saint of God. And I think that she means so much more than that. She joined the military not specifically just to fight people. She joined because she believed in a prophecy that she would save and protect France. And she wasn't just a regular good Christian. Yes, they see her as a saint, but like she was murdering people. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I do find it really fascinating. Her modern perception as a saint, was done almost 500 years after her death. And ultimately, I think, yeah, I just think as a human race, this is something we need to examine. Our obsession with turning humans into icons and turning people into figureheads, into prophets. And it's often after they die. And often while they're alive, they are experiencing prejudice, condemnation, murder, trial. And I find it fascinating. I find it truly fascinating. And I wonder if Jesus had not been crucified, would his following have grown at the same rate? And I asked the same thing for Joan of Arc. If Joan of Arc had not been killed and burned at the stake, would she be a saint? I don't know. I truly don't know. I don't have an answer. And so, perhaps Joan of Arc's greatest legacy was that she was a woman who defied all social expectations with her own intuition and visions and was able to impersonate a man, join the military, prevail in victory, all before the age of 19. She was a visionary. She was a woman who transcended rules and the constructs of her daily reality. This woman lived as a human being, undefined by her gender, undefined by her social status, undefined by her training as a knight. This person was an autonomous person who made decisions based on what their intuition told them. And perhaps this is why she was sentenced to death. But it puts some things into perspective, no? I think it's easy to theorize and have ideas of who we are as people, but sometimes you really don't know who you are until you're put into a stressful situation, until you're put into war, until you're put into a life or death situation. You don't really know who you are. And more than anything, we can say that Joan of Arc was incredibly brave and self-defined. And that is why, for me, she is, in a sense, a personal icon. To be a person living in an oppressive time with so many rules, and yet she lived a life based off of her own intuition and autonomy, and she prevailed. She's a queen. She's an icon. And that is the story of Joan of Arc. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you. You're an incredible person. It doesn't have to be this difficult. You need to follow your heart and you need to follow your intuition. You only have one time to be this version of yourself. So follow your dreams. Why not? I love you. I believe in you. I'll catch you next time.